really excited to be here. I'm at Epstein Becker Green. I'm a law attorney, have been practicing in the health law space for 19 years, mostly on the regulatory side, a little transactional work here and there. And then in the past 4 years, I would say I sort of unexpectedly became a COVID lawyer. And then over the last year, have been practicing very deeply in the reproductive healthcare space. So I'm excited to be here to chat with everyone, and I'm very happy and honored to introduce you to Jennifer Piatt. She is a research scholar and the co-director of the Center for Public Health Law and Policy at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you, Jenny.
We were laughing as we started this because we've got a Jennifer, Jen, and a Jenny on this. So, it's something about the United States of America in the 70s and 80s that there's so many of us. We
really need to start a Jennifer's for Abortion club.
There you go. So my firm is a boutique firm that focuses on health law and employment. And so because those are our two areas of specialty, when the Dobbs decision came out, it impacted almost every client that we have in some way. And it, every lawyer in the firm said, okay, let's Friday, June 24th, let's read this, let's talk about it all afternoon into the weekend, let's meet, how is this going to impact our clients? How can we help them? From an employment perspective, we've had lots of discussions with clients about group health plan coverage, company policies, clarifying what reproductive healthcare services are covered, how to communicate with employees about that, and what type of liability there might be if the employer wishes to cover something that is in conflict with the state in which the company is operating. On the manufacturing side, we've had lots of discussions about distributing and prescribing and dispensing medications related to reproductive health and monitoring all of the associated litigation, which we're seeing, we've seen for a year and we expect to see a lot more of. From a data perspective, we do a lot of privacy and data work, and we're not just worried about personal health information in the traditional healthcare setting when you think of just your traditional medical record, but really we're thinking about it in all aspects of digital health, especially with things like reproductive healthcare apps. And it's not just what we think of, I think, as the traditional medical information. Health law nerds like me might call that PHI. It's not just that, but we're also thinking about things we didn't really consider before, like geolocation. And then finally, in the healthcare provider space, which is really the work that I do, we've spent the last year working through what changes are happening in state law since this issue's been pushed to the states, and how those changes are impacting the services that providers can provide to their patients, and how they can continue to provide safe and effective care to their patients. And, some of the things that have arisen over the last year is, I think, first and foremost, so much fear amongst providers because the penalties associated with these restrictive states are so severe, including criminal penalties. And so, you're looking at issues like, does your medical negligence insurance cover criminal penalties? Because before, those are things that were typically excluded. And now those are things that we have to think about as states have criminalized some of these reproductive care activities. There's also been a lot of confusion amongst providers as to things like whether EMTALA, the federal EMTALA law applies, and whether that means that they can, in certain settings, provide reproductive health care that may be prohibited by their states. And we have cases in Idaho and Texas, federal cases that disagree with each other as to whether EMTALA does trump in each of those states. So understandable confusion and fear amongst providers. And then I think overall, the phone calls that we get that are the toughest are the women who are just not receiving the same care that they would have prior to the Dobbs decision coming out, even in cases of things like a miscarriage. we're past the point of thinking about whether an abortion is appropriate care. The woman is having a miscarriage, and we have providers that are frightened to provide the care that they know is appropriate for this patient, and understandably so. And so, it's been such a significant impact over the last year to individual women in this country. Obviously, when you add that all up, it's, the impact is on hundreds of thousands of people. But when you hear these individual cases that are really just heartbreaking, it can be overwhelming. So with all of that, with the overview of trends, Jen, tell me, does any of this resonate with your work? Tell us a little bit about the research you're doing and your background.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. So you mentioned that you sort of unexpectedly became a COVID lawyer during COVID, and I think that is true for many lawyers across the country. So I work at ASU at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at the Center for Public Health Law and Policy. And basically what we do is we research, we teach, we work with students to forward and to benefit the public's health and understanding of how laws can sort of intersect with that across a number of different, arenas, because public health is in everything. And so when COVID came, of course, we all turned into sort of COVID attorneys dealing with, the vaccine questions and the emergency response and preparedness efforts. But as soon as the court took up Dobbs, this is where I sort of pivoted my specific efforts and my research. Reproductive health, reproductive rights, reproductive justice. And so we have been sort of taking a very analytical academic approach to sort of analyzing, tracking the trends, tracking the litigation that's going on across the country, tracking some of the bills that are being passed that are potentially benefiting these rights, and some of the bills that are really not benefiting and in fact making things much worse. And so you mentioned a couple of trends that you've noticed would be confusion and sort of this chilling effect. And that is absolutely 100% true. And when we talk about Arizona, I can get into a little bit more detail about the confusion there. But like on the ground, all of a sudden, overnight, all of the right goes away. And now all of these laws that are on the books in states across the country that may have been passed 100, 150 years ago, all of a sudden, folks don't know, does that law now apply to me? And providers don't know, am I not only risking my license, but going to go to prison for providing the standard of care that I provide normally? And in some cases, am I going to go to prison, for example, in Alabama, for 99 years, for the entirety of the rest of my life? So the risk factor here is really enormous. And I also want to sort of piggyback back to the conversation that was going on previously with Jennifer and Amol and talk about this sort of growing lack of equity nationally that is occurring because of this. Because, of course, you have states that are moving in really protective directions. States like California, states like New York, states like Michigan are moving in really, really wonderful directions. States like New Jersey, right? In Illinois, to improve access, to make sure that people can get access when they can afford to come and travel to those states, or when they can get travel funds to be able to go to those states. And so the direction is pulling this way in those states, but it's pulling way, way, way to the opposite direction in those states that are not only, banning abortion, but attaching really harsh criminal penalties to it, are recruiting citizens to act as bounty hunters in cases like Texas and Oklahoma to sort of enforce those laws that the state didn't really think it could constitutionally enforce at the time. So the equity, talk about a lack of equity. We have states going in complete opposite directions. And like Amal said, it's just an accident of where you were born. That depends on what rights and what access you might have.
No, that's absolutely right. It's interesting to watch two different things. First, let me address a piece of the equity, and this gets to, I think, some of the questions in the chat as well. But, as you're talking about trends and you're studying trends and we're thinking about them too, but probably, more anecdotally, not as scientifically as you're doing it. But what we're seeing is, of course, all of these questions coming out of programs in restrictive states saying, we're not getting the same number of people applying for residencies here. What does this mean for our OB-GYN program? And then, of course, if you don't have residents, then you don't necessarily end up with physicians in your state. So, for women who have the ability to leave, what we're thinking is going to happen is that there's going to be flight from those states. And of course, as we know, there's many women that don't have the ability to leave a state. And so then they're stuck in a reproductive desert as a result of this decision. And so it's I've seen some models play this out across the United States as to what this will look like from access to care perspective. And, I'm so grateful to people like yourself, Jen, and Jennifer and Amal, who spoke earlier, and to the, clinicians, the physicians that are going to speak next, who are focused on providing this care and providing access to care. But I do worry as to what this means for access really to any medical care across the United States, and then the impact of that on those communities. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, 100%. And it's in like a death by a thousand cuts. The approach to sort of reproductive health is cutting away at healthcare access in general in all kinds of ways, in the ways that you mentioned, but also in what I hope many of our audience members are familiar with, the mifepristone litigation that's ongoing right now. The mifepristone litigation that argues that FDA did not have the legal authority to ever approve mifepristone all the way back in 2000, based on a theory of standing that is incredibly ludicrous, in my opinion. That essentially says that anytime any product that the FDA has approved could potentially harm somebody, a doctor has standing to challenge it because that person might wind up in their exam room at some point. Okay, well, now we're throwing open the floodgates to challenging every single FDA approved product, drug, medical device, you name it. And the determinations that are made on those may land in front of very partisan judges like the judge who's involved in the mifepristone case. So there's a real danger here if appellate courts don't necessarily, get in the way of that. And if the US Supreme Court doesn't stop that from happening, of just a serious limitation to healthcare access in general.
And some of the issues that we've seen spin out of that are things that I think that at least our generation of Americans has not really ever thought would be relevant again. And one of those being travel across state lines. There's been lots of conversation about what's happening in some of the restrictive states to try to prevent their citizens from seeking reproductive care in other states. Obviously Texas being a state that has had conversations and proposed legislation about all sorts of things around this topic. But, Idaho most recently criminalizing the act of providing travel assistance to minors seeking abortion across state lines without parental consent. So, I think most Americans have always thought about traveling freely across state lines for any reason of their choosing. And so to be in the position where your activities are questioned, are tracked. When we talked about geolocation earlier, when we say it's a whole new world, I don't think that's dramatic at all. It really is.
No, it totally is. I think that the Dobbs decision, as horrifying as it is, it also emboldened this sort of approach, this idea, okay, none of the US Supreme Court's decisions are actually set in stone. And that means none of the legal environment in the US is actually set in stone. And that means that we can pass these laws and we can bring these challenges that no reasonable attorney ever would have thought would be brought, because they're being given the light of day, because the US Supreme Court is saying, actually, stability, precedent, I don't really care. We're going to do what we want to do, which is a really, really scary can of worms to have opened.
Absolutely. So I know you are, and we have been watching state by state legislation, court decisions, and then ballot initiatives have been very interesting to see those pop up We've got one in my home state of Ohio this November. And so, one of the challenging things for providers has been to see the law flip-flop back and forth. I mean, obviously we had, Roe and Casey in place until the Dobbs decision. Dobbs changed things overnight. As you pointed out, many 100-year-old laws suddenly went into place. They've been challenged. Some of them have been stayed by court decisions. So I think, one of the largest challenges for providers and for the public has been to understand what is actually the law right now, because it's not even easy for lawyers. I mean, we have 1,000 spreadsheets tracking which case is at which point, and even though a law looks like it's on the books, it's actually not enforced. It's just very difficult for your average woman seeking reproductive care or your average provider just trying to provide care to understand what can or can't I do, especially when it looked different yesterday and it might look different tomorrow. Have you seen that in Arizona?
Yes, 1,000%. Because we had passed in Arizona a 15-week ban right before Dobbs, but we had in Arizona a pre-statehood 1864 law that fully banned abortion. And so after Dobbs fell, all of a sudden the Arizona Attorney General is saying, that pre-statehood law looks pretty good to me. I'm going to try to enforce it, and takes it to court to see if he can enforce it. And so we had this really crazy cycle in Arizona where Planned Parenthood all of a sudden stopped offering their services. And then when a point in the litigation occurred where there was a stay on the pre-statehood law, they started offering them again. And then they stopped again. And then they started again, because it's all this real confusion has a real chilling effect on providers who just want to be complying with the law, but also want to be providing the services that they've been providing for 50 years lawfully within their states. So it's really an environment of confusion. And I think in some part, maybe that's the point. Maybe the confusion is the point, because for the anti-abortion movement, because they get this sort of chilling effect out of it.
Yeah, as we look to try to help providers understand, what they can and can't do, we've been trying to provide some guardrails, or, some guidance on, how do you even approach this? And so obviously, first one is understand, in any state that you practice, understand what the current state of the state law is, which, as we've said, is not always easy. And so, you may need legal counsel, talk to leadership at your organization, but really understand what that is. Importantly, monitor local enforcement. We certainly have places across the U.S. where we have local law enforcement saying they're not enforcing some of these things. I think it's difficult to ask people to rely on that sort of statement, but at least understand what the environment is where you're practicing. Understand, what your insurance policies might say, what they do and don't cover, and whether they need updated. And importantly, educate your teams. Workforce of both clinicians and non-clinicians, everybody needs to understand what the current state is, and who to go to, importantly, who to go to for questions, which we have a lot of different providers that form multifaceted teams for decision-making in emergent clinical situations. And I know it's really unfortunate, and I always apologize when I jump on. It's hard to say, I have a clinical situation, I need to have legal on the phone. It feels like I shouldn't be part of that conversation, but given the current state of things, I understand, why we're often asked to be part of it. And if we can help provide, okay, here's how we fit it into this definition, et cetera, I'm glad to be able to offer that support. But given that providers are scared to provide a team that can come around urgent clinical decision and help get to the right place on it, is hopefully helpful. But I'm curious, Jen, for those audience members looking for ways to protect their own access to reproductive health and that of others, what's your recommendation?
My recommendation is in part really similar to what we've heard before. Have conversations with people, talk about these issues, make it, humanize these issues, because I think in many cases people are not seeing the human beings that are harmed when these beliefs are put into law. The other suggestion that I would make really quickly is vote. vote, vote, vote. As Amal said, abortion is a winning issue. We saw that in states that we wouldn't have expected to see that in the last midterms, when Kentucky kicked out an anti-abortion provision, when Montana kicked out an anti-abortion provision, when Kansas kicked out an anti-abortion provision. We see this being able to gain traction, even in states where we wouldn't necessarily think it would. And another really important reason to vote, vote, vote is that Dobbs is not the end of the anti-abortion movement here. It's the beginning of a brand new chapter. And as bad as things are right now, I promise you they can get a whole lot worse. So it's really important not to give up. Have conversations with friends that don't vote, with friends, bring your family, get people to the polls to get your voice heard on these issues is the most important thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen. It's been so nice talking with you about these issues. I know we could talk for several hours more, so I'll give you a call.
Sounds wonderful.